the kind of loneliness no one talks about. Loneliness is not just about being alone, it's about feeling forgotten even when people are nearby. It's about hearing laughter down the hall and wondering when it last belonged to you. It's about being in a room full of people and still feeling like a ghost. For the elderly, loneliness doesn't always arrive with tears. Sometimes it shows up quietly in the form of long afternoons, cold dinners, or a calendar that remains blank week after week. We often talk about aging in numbers, 60, 70, 80. But what we rarely talk about is how the world becomes quieter as we age. Not just in sound, but in attention. We assume they're used to it. We think they've lived enough. We believe silence is natural, even peaceful. But what if we're wrong? What if that silence isn't peace, but a slow aching kind of grief? This is not an article about pity. This is a reflection on what we fail to see and what we still have time to change. Here are 6 truths about loneliness in old age that are too often ignored. Not because we don't care, but because we never stopped long enough to notice. Loneliness doesn't always look like sadness. We often imagine loneliness as someone crying in a dark room, but in reality, it wears many faces. Sometimes it looks like an old man watering his plants, slowly, methodically, because there's nothing else waiting for him that day. Other times it's a woman who hums to herself in the kitchen, not because she's cheerful, but because the silence has become too loud. Loneliness is not always loud. It doesn't always ask for help. It doesn't always wear tears. Sometimes it shows up in perfectly made beds, in chairs that haven't been moved in months, in meals cooked for 2 but eaten by 1. The elderly often hide their loneliness well. They smile so we don't worry. They say, "I'm fine," because they've learned that most people won't stay long enough to hear otherwise. But underneath that calm surface there is often a longing, not for attention, not for noise, but for presence. Just someone to sit with them, to listen, to let the minutes pass without needing to say much at all. Loneliness in old age isn't always dramatic. It's slow, it's quiet, and that's what makes it so easy to overlook. The world grows smaller, and people don't notice. As people age, their world begins to shrink. The things that once gave their days shape, work, children, errands, even the commute, begin to disappear. The body slows down. The invitations stop coming. Friends move away or pass on. Family becomes busy with their own lives, and slowly, quietly, the 4 walls of home begin to feel like a boundary they can't cross. The grocery store trip becomes a major event. A short walk to the mailbox feels like an expedition. Conversations become rare and precious, like birds landing briefly before flying off again. But the world outside keeps moving. Faster, louder, more distracted, and the elderly, once pillars of families, of communities, start to feel like background noise in a life that no longer has room for them. Not because people are cruel, but because they're busy. Because they assume their parents or grandparents are doing fine. Because checking in feels like something that can always wait until tomorrow. But time doesn't wait, and neither does loneliness. The truth is, as their world shrinks, our attention should grow. Not out of guilt, but out of love. Out of the simple recognition that presence is a gift, and that the absence of it, day after day, can quietly break a person. Older adults don't always want quiet. Sometimes they just don't want to be a burden. There's a quiet myth that lingers in many households. Old people just want peace and quiet. It's said with good intentions and often assumed as truth. Children lower their voices when visiting. Grandchildren play in another room. Family members don't share their stress or worries, believing it's better not to bother the elderly. But what if that quiet wasn't really a desire, but a mask? What if silence in many older people's lives is not a preference, but a surrender? The myth of wanting. Less as people age, society often expects them to want less. Less noise, less activity, less involvement. And over time, those around them begin to take things away. Subtly, almost invisibly. Fewer conversations, fewer shared decisions, fewer invitations. And when the elderly don't protest, we interpret that as acceptance. But very often it's not acceptance, it's adaptation. They sense the changes. They see how busy their children are. They recognize how fast the world has become. And so they quietly step back. Not because they want to disappear, but because they fear being in the way. They fear being one more thing for others to worry about. I don't want to trouble anyone. A sentence full of weight. Ask many elderly people why they don't speak up, don't call, don't share what's on their minds. The answer is heartbreakingly consistent. I don't want to trouble anyone. That sentence carries layers of unspoken emotion. I know they're busy. I'm not as fast or sharp anymore. I don't want to seem needy or dramatic. They have their own lives. Mine is already winding down. So instead of expressing themselves, they bottle up their feelings. Instead of asking for help, they figure it out on their own. Instead of saying, I'm lonely, they smile and say, I'm okay. And so, to the outside world, it looks like they've chosen quiet, but inside they may be yearning for connection, conversation, relevance, the deep need to still matter. Every human being, regardless of age, has a deep desire to feel that they still matter. Older adults may no longer work a full-time job. They may not manage a household the way they once did. But that doesn't mean their need to be seen, heard, and valued goes away. When their opinions are never asked, when their stories are gently brushed aside as old talk, when decisions are made for them, not with them, they begin to internalize a dangerous thought. Maybe I don't matter anymore. And from that moment, they begin to withdraw, not out of peace, but out of pain. Silence is not always serenity. There is a kind of silence that brings peace. The stillness of a sunset, the quiet of a morning walk. But the silence that comes from feeling invisible, that's a silence that aches. That's not restfulness, that's resignation. And too often society mistakes one for the other. What they truly want, most older adults don't need grand gestures. They don't need loud parties, expensive gifts, or daily entertainment. What they deeply long for is simple, human, and profoundly healing. To be included, to be asked how they feel and really listened to be invited to share stories, even if they've told them before, to feel useful in some small way, even if their hands tremble, to know that their presence is not a burden, but a blessing. Sometimes when an older person says they want to be left alone, what they're really saying is, I'm afraid I no longer have a place. And giving them that place back, in our hearts, in our homes, in our conversations, might just be the most powerful medicine of all. For loneliness doesn't always show on the surface. Many seniors become masters at hiding it. Not all pain cries out. Not all loneliness looks like sadness. And not every elderly person who smiles is truly okay. In fact, some of the loneliest people in the world are also the ones who seem the most composed, the most cheerful, the most at peace. Because as the years go by, many older adults become quiet experts in the art of hiding what they truly feel. They learn to smile through the silence. It doesn't happen all at once. At first, they might mention their feelings. I haven't heard from anyone this week. I miss when the house used to be loud. I don't get out much these days. But when those words are brushed off or met with rushed answers, things are just busy lately. You'll see the kids next weekend. Or worse, don't be so negative. They slowly learn. Maybe silence is better. They tuck their feelings away. They master the art of small talk. They smile politely. They nod when others speak, and they say, I'm fine, and even when they're not, because they've learned. People are more comfortable with your smile than your sadness. They become the ones who ask, not the ones who are asked. One of the subtle signs of hidden loneliness is this. Older adults begin to only ask about others and rarely talk about themselves. They'll ask how the kids are doing. They'll ask how work is going. They'll listen to every detail about your weekend. But when it comes to their own lives, they keep things brief. Oh, nothing much happening here. They shift the spotlight away from themselves. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they no longer feel their life is worth talking about. In truth, many of them are starving for conversation, but too afraid of being seen as boring, repetitive, or out of touch. So instead they just ask, they just listen, and they keep their loneliness folded up in their lap, like a letter no one ever opens. They hide it so well, even their family doesn't know. A daughter may say, My mum's always been independent and she doesn't mind being alone. A son may say dad never complains. He's probably enjoying the quiet. But in reality, that independence might be masking a deep ache. That silence might be covering years of unspoken grief, lost friendships, and days that feel endlessly long. It's not that they don't feel, it's that they've learned not to reveal. Years of growing up in different generations, where emotions were hidden, privacy was sacred, and vulnerability was considered weakness, have taught them to keep their suffering private. But just because someone doesn't show pain doesn't mean they're not feeling it. Loneliness has 1,000 faces. Sometimes it looks like staring at the television with the sound low. Sometimes it looks like organizing old photos for the 3rd time that week. Sometimes it sounds like a voicemail never returned, a birthday uncelebrated, a dinner eaten alone. Other times, it looks like an old man sitting on the porch, waving at cars that don't stop, a woman baking too much food, just in case someone visits, a perfectly made bed in a perfectly silent room. These small images seem innocent on the outside, but inside they hold a weight no one sees. The greatest courage is asking. Twice, one of the kindest acts we can offer the elderly in our lives is this. Don't always believe the first "I'm fine," ask again. Ask gently, ask with presence, and most of all, be willing to sit in the silence that follows, because sometimes what they need most is not an answer, but a space to finally let go of the mask, to be real, to be seen. And in that space, perhaps for the first time in a long time, they will feel something even more powerful than company. They will feel understood. Technology bridges the world, but can deepen the distance for the elderly. We live in a time where connection is easier than ever. With a tap of a screen, a swipe, or a voice command, we can reach anyone, anywhere, instantly. Photos are shared in real time. Family updates are posted daily. Messages arrive within seconds. And yet, many elderly people have never felt more left behind. Because while the world has grown faster, louder, and more digital, their world has grown quieter, smaller, and harder to understand. The digital world is not designed for slower hands or older eyes. Most apps, websites, and devices are built for speed, efficiency, and youth. Tiny buttons, rapid notifications, slang-filled messages, constant updates. For younger generations, these are conveniences. For many older adults, they are barriers. A shaky finger struggling to type on a glass screen, eyes straining to read small text, confusion when a button disappears after an update. Fear of pressing the wrong thing and breaking something. Some try to learn, they take classes, they ask questions, they watch tutorials, but for others the effort feels overwhelming, and with each failed attempt a quiet message starts to form in their minds. This world is no longer for me. They're always on their phones, but no one calls. It's one of the most heartbreaking truths spoken by many elderly people today. They see their children, grandchildren, neighbors, heads down, eyes locked on phones, scrolling, typing, laughing, and they wonder, if they're always online, why can't they take a moment to talk to me? They don't need long conversations. Sometimes even a simple voice message saying "thinking of you" is enough. But more often than not, messages go unanswered, or worse, never arrive. The cruel irony is this: the tools that were meant to bring people closer often leave the elderly feeling even more distant. They see lives unfolding on screens they cannot access. They hear of events only after they've happened. They receive photos with no stories, updates with no warmth. And in that digital silence, the loneliness grows louder. Virtual is not the same as personal. A text message is not a hug. A Facebook post is not a conversation. A video call, no matter how clear, is not the same as sitting side by side, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. For older adults, especially those who have known a world before screens, real presence still matters more than digital presence. They crave eye contact. They find meaning in long pauses. They listen more than they scroll. And they notice when someone shows up, not just with a phone in hand, but with a heart wide open. They want to. Learned fine, but they also need patience. Not all elderly people reject technology. Many are curious, many are willing. Some are even excited, but they need someone patient enough to teach without judgment. Not rolling eyes, not rushed instructions, not sighs of frustration, just someone to sit with them. Explain slowly, repeat when needed. Celebrate small wins, like sending their first emoji or joining their first video call. Because when they feel empowered, technology can become a bridge, not a wall. Real connection still begins in the E. Human heart. No app can replace affection. No notification feels like a warm hand on the shoulder. No algorithm knows how to listen when someone says, "I miss the old days." In a world spinning faster by the hour, perhaps the greatest act of love is to slow down, to step away from the screen and into someone's quiet world, to sit, to ask, to truly be there. Because while technology may connect devices, only presence connects souls. 6. What seems like peaceful aging might be silent. Grief. There's a tender image many of us carry in our minds when we think of old age. An elderly man sitting in his garden, quietly watching the wind move through the trees. A grandmother, humming softly as she folds a clean stack of clothes. An older couple sitting on the porch saying nothing, just being. We often call this peace. We say, they're aging gracefully. They seem so content now. They've made their peace with life, but what if sometimes that calmness isn't peace at all? What if that stillness is really a quiet kind of grief, one so deep, so private, that it no longer asks to be seen? The grief that has no funeral. When someone dies, we know how to respond. We send flowers, we hold hands, we cry, we show up. But there are other kinds of losses, quieter, slower, invisible, that don't come with ceremonies, and yet they cut just as deep. The loss of mobility, the fading of memory, the moment a familiar street becomes strange, the sound of a voice that hasn't been heard in years, the sudden realization that no one calls you mom or dad with urgency anymore, the ache of knowing you're no longer needed the way you once were. These are not dramatic losses. They arrive without warning. They accumulate like dust, and over time they weigh heavily on the soul. But because there's no event, no one notices. And so the elderly grieve in silence, over and over, for things they themselves can't always name. They grieve people who are still alive. This is a quiet heartbreak that few talk about. An aging parent may still have adult children, but those children have moved across the city, across the country, across the rhythm of life. Phone calls become shorter, visits become rare, photos are sent, but stories are missing. Love is still there, but it feels distant. And so, the elderly begin to grieve people who are still alive. Not because they've died, but because they've drifted away. This kind of grief has no closure. It lingers. It's not about anger or blame, it's about missing what used to be shared. They grieve the person they used to be. There is also a very personal kind of mourning that grows with age. Grief for one's younger self, the body that once moved without pain, the mind that remembered everything with clarity, the sense of purpose that came from raising children, building a career, or tending a home. Now many elderly people wake to long days without structure. They find themselves asking, what am I for now? Where do I still belong? And even as they smile politely or carry out their routine, a quiet sorrow walks beside them, the sorrow of being slowly forgotten by the world and at times by themselves. Grief wears many masks. Some days it looks like tiredness, other days it hides behind irritability or silence. Sometimes it appears as indifference. I'm fine, they say, waving it away. But underneath, there is often a longing no one sees, a tenderness, a memory held like glass in trembling hands, a name whispered only in dreams, and because they don't want to bring the mood down, they keep it all tucked inside. How we can meet their grief. With gentle presence, we cannot take the grief away. It is part of living, but we can make sure it doesn't grow in darkness. We can ask real questions and wait for real answers. Make time to listen without trying to fix. let them tell the same story again and again, because each time they're really saying, please don't let this memory die with me. Notice when their quietness feels heavier than usual. Remind them gently that their past is not all they have. Their presence still matters. Sometimes all it takes is one person who cares enough to sit with them in the quiet. Not to cheer them up, not to distract, just to be there, without rushing, without noise. In that simple act, grief becomes a little lighter, and life, even in its twilight, becomes a little warmer. Aging is not just a process. It is a passage into a different kind of knowing, a deeper stillness, a slower beauty, but also a greater vulnerability. And in that space, the elderly don't need to be saved. They don't need to be pitied. What they need is to be accompanied with gentleness, with respect, with the kind of love that stays even when there are no more words, because sometimes the most powerful way to honor someone's life is simply to sit beside their grief and let them know they're not alone. When we truly see the elderly, we begin to heal a hidden wound in the world. Loneliness, in old age, is not always loud. It doesn't always come with tears or pleas. It doesn't knock. It lingers, like a shadow in a quiet room, like a sigh no one hears. And too often, we mistake silence for peace, solitude for preference, resignation for contentment. But behind those still mornings, behind the framed photographs, behind the polite smiles and gentle "I'm okays," there lives a depth of emotion we rarely pause long enough to feel. This article wasn't meant to stir sadness. It was meant to offer something even more urgent, even more human awareness. Because once we truly see the elderly, not just as parents or neighbors or grandparents, but as full human beings still yearning for connection, for meaning, for presence, something softens inside us, and in that softening we remember that growing old is not a failure. It is a passage, that loneliness is not a weakness. It is a whisper asking to be heard, that the elderly don't need to be fixed, only seen, only honored, only held in the light of our presence. You don't need to change the world to make a difference. You only need to call your mother just to listen, visit your neighbor without a reason, sit with your grandfather and let the silence stretch. Ask your elderly aunt about her childhood and really listen. Send a letter, make a cup of tea, linger just a little longer, because in the end the antidote to loneliness isn't grand or complex. It's simple, sacred presence, one moment of care, one act of slowing down, one person who chooses not to look away. That is enough. That can change a life. And perhaps one day when we too walk the slower path of aging, someone will pause long enough to see us, not as burdens or relics, but as living stories, as whole hearts, as people still worthy of being held. In the gentle light of love, no one is ever truly old. No one is ever truly alone.